Nobody ever walked into this story knowing what they were truly looking for. For generations, we have been told she was the most beautiful woman who ever lived. But now, new DNA analysis and forensic reconstruction are pointing toward a terrifying alternative. The last pharaoh of Egypt may not have been a beauty queen at all. She may have been a genetic time bomb walking the halls of power. The DNA connected to Cleopatra has finally been examined, and what it has revealed is absolutely chilling. It appears that her greatest battle was never against the Roman Empire. Her greatest battle was against her own biology. And here is the part that stops you cold. The clues have been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years. You simply had to know where to look. For 2,000 years, the sands of Egypt have been holding on to one very specific secret. A secret that has driven historians and treasure hunters to the edge of obsession for centuries. We are talking about the final resting place of the last pharaoh, Queen Cleopatra. Ask most experts, and they will tell you she is gone forever. They will say she is buried somewhere beneath the modern streets of Alexandria, swallowed up by earthquakes and rising tides and centuries of urban construction. Lost, irretrievable, a closed case. But for the last 20 years, one woman has stood in front of that consensus and said they were all wrong. That woman is Kathleen Martinez. She is not the kind of academic you picture sitting behind a desk in a university office. She is a criminal lawyer turned archaeologist from the Dominican Republic. And she did not come to this problem like a history lesson. She came to it like a cold case investigation. She treated the disappearance of Cleopatra like a crime scene that needed to be methodically deciphered. While every other researcher was looking left, Martinez looked right. Her careful profile of the evidence led her 30 miles west of Alexandria to a forgotten crumbling temple complex called Taposiris Magna. And in 2022, the ground beneath feet finally gave something up. Martinez and her team broke through the limestone and found something that simply should not have been there. A tunnel. But not just any tunnel. This structure is a shocking replica of a legendary ancient design. It is carved through solid bedrock and stretches over 4,300 feet. That is nearly a full mile underground. It stands 6 feet high, submerged in mud and groundwater, and it drives straight toward the Mediterranean Sea. Architects who have studied it are calling it a geometric miracle, an engineering masterpiece that mirrors the legendary ancient Greek tunnel of Samos. But the question that follows is the one worth a million answers. Why? Why go to this extreme? Why carve a mile-long passage 40 feet underground through dangerous, unstable rock? You do not build something like that for a minor site. You do not commit those resources and that level of engineering genius for a forgotten corner of the ancient world. The scale of it implies massive importance. The discovery of a sunken port just off the nearby coastline adds another layer to the picture, suggesting this was not simply a remote temple sitting in the desert. It was a hub of activity, a place of real significance. And Martinez believes this tunnel leads to the end of the line. Her theory is terrifyingly straightforward. Cleopatra was not merely hiding from death. She was hiding from Rome. She was hiding from the unbearable humiliation of being paraded through the streets of the capital city in iron chains, a trophy of Roman conquest. She wanted to be buried alongside her lover, Mark Antony. She wanted to be immortalized as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. And to accomplish that, she needed a tomb that could never be defiled, never be found, never be raided. She buried herself where she believed no one would ever think to look. Kathleen Martinez may have found the front door to that sanctuary. And while the queen herself has not yet been located, every piece of evidence uncovered so far points toward a dark and extraordinary truth. Inside the complex at Taposiris Magna, The team made another discovery that sent shivers down their spines and changed the direction of the entire investigation. Buried within 16 rock-cut tombs were mummies. But these were not ordinary burials in any sense of the word. When the archaeologists looked closely into the deteriorating faces of the dead, they saw something glittering in the darkness. Gold. Inside their mouths, placed precisely where their tongues should have been, were amulets crafted from gold foil. The ancient Egyptians believed with complete conviction that to survive the journey through the afterlife, you had to stand before Osiris, the lord of the underworld, and you had to speak. You had to plead your case before the god of death himself. The golden tongue gave the deceased the power to do exactly that. It granted what the ancient texts describe as golden eloquence, the supernatural ability to address a god. But the question that Martinez kept returning to was this: why are they here? Why at this specific temple, in this specific location? Martinez believes these were not simply wealthy aristocrats who happened to be buried nearby. She believes these were Cleopatra's people, her inner circle, her courtiers. They were buried here fully equipped with the ancient magic required to speak to Osiris, perhaps placed here specifically to announce the arrival of their queen when she came to join them. Think carefully about what that interpretation actually means. This is not just a graveyard that researchers stumbled across. This is a royal reception hall constructed for the afterlife. This is her necropolis. And if the courtiers are already here, waiting in formation for their queen, then the door is very nearly ready to open. Despite everything Martinez has uncovered, she remains agonizingly close to obtaining Cleopatra's DNA without quite reaching it. But while the world waits for her to break through the final barrier, researchers believed for a long time that they already possessed a key to Cleopatra's genetic code through another source entirely. To see Cleopatra's face, some scientists argued, you did not need to wait for the tunnel. You simply needed to examine the bones of the sister she had eliminated. To understand the dead found at Taposiris Magna, you first have to understand the cold ruthlessness of the woman they served. History has chosen to remember Cleopatra as the great seductress, the irresistible enchantress who bent Rome to her will. But her family was less like a royal court and more like a shark tank, and her greatest threat was never a Roman general sitting across a negotiating table. Her greatest threat was her own younger sister, Arsinoe IV. This was a relationship defined entirely by toxic ambition and survival instinct. When Cleopatra was exiled from Egypt, it was Arsinoe who moved in and claimed the throne. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt and the political situation exploded, it was Arsinoe who raised an army and led it against him. She was a warrior princess who actually succeeded in trapping Caesar inside the palace. Complex for a period of time. But history, as it always does, was written by the survivors. Arsinoe was eventually captured and dragged to Rome, where she was forced to march through the streets in chains as part of Caesar's triumph. The Roman crowds reportedly wept watching her. A teenage girl in shackles being displayed like a prize animal. That public sympathy saved her life, and she was sent into exile at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in what is now modern-day Turkey. She believed she was safe there. She believed the sacred ground of a holy temple would protect her from the reach of her sister. She was wrong. In 41 BCE, Cleopatra persuaded Mark Antony to do something that shocked even the ancient world. He dispatched assassins to the temple steps. They dragged Arsinoe out from the sanctuary and ended her life on holy ground. It was a scandal that rippled through every corner of the ancient world. But for researchers 2,000 years later, it provided something invaluable. It provided a location. They knew exactly where this particular story had ended. For centuries, Arsinoe was considered lost to history like so many others from the ancient world. until the early 1900s, when archaeologists working in Ephesus discovered a distinctive tomb known as the Octagon. Inside the tomb was a skeleton. The remains belonged to a young person, and everything about the discovery seemed to align. The timeline matched. The location matched. The approximate age matched. If the theory was correct, then these remains might be those of Arsinoe the Fourth herself, the murdered princess of Egypt. And if that was true, then researchers had stumbled onto something extraordinary. They had Cleopatra's closest genetic relative. They had a biological map to the queen's lineage, her ethnicity, her inherited health conditions, her physical appearance. They believed they held the answer to one of history's most enduring questions in their hands. But science has a particular talent for dismantling a compelling story at precisely the wrong moment. Initial DNA testing on the skeleton failed completely due to contamination. The bones had passed through too many hands over too many decades. But in 2025, a new round of advanced analysis finally produced a definitive answer. And the results were not just shocking. According to the researchers involved, they were biologically impossible to reconcile with the original theory. The breakthrough had actually begun in 2022. A team from the University of Vienna, led by anthropologist Gerhard Weber, finally located the long-missing skull from the Ephesus skeleton in the university's own archives. It had been sitting there, completely unnoticed, for decades. This was the moment everything changed. The researchers did not simply examine the skull visually. They saw through it entirely. Using high-resolution micro-CT scanning technology, they constructed a detailed digital map of the bone structure. They also managed to extract material from the petrous temporal bone, which is the densest portion of the human skull, a kind of biological vault that can preserve DNA even after every other part of the skeleton has crumbled to dust. In January 2025, the results of this work were published in scientific reports, and they told a medical horror story that no one had anticipated. The skeleton was not Arsinoe. It was not a 20-year-old woman. It was not an African princess of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The DNA confirmed the presence of a Y chromosome. The supposed sister of Cleopatra was, in biological fact, a boy. Specifically, the analysis determined he was an adolescent male, somewhere between 11 and 14 years of age, and beyond simply being young and male, he had been suffering. The scans revealed severe developmental disorders. His jaw was stunted and underdeveloped. His skull was asymmetrical and structurally twisted. The analysis suggested conditions consistent with Treacher-Collins syndrome or severe rickets, both of which produce significant physical deformities, particularly affecting the facial bones and the skeletal structure. This was not a healthy royal rival who had been hunted down and eliminated for political reasons. This was a child whose body had been reshaped by genetic misfortune. Even more disorienting was what the DNA revealed about his origins. He was not from Egypt. His genetic markers pointed clearly back toward Italy or Sardinia, which opens an entirely different and far darker mystery. Researchers had believed they were examining the victim of a political assassination carried out on the steps of a temple. Instead, they were looking at a tragedy of a completely different kind. The Octagon tomb, it turned out, was likely a heroon, a burial monument constructed for a hero or semi-divine figure of some kind. So the question becomes even stranger and more disturbing. Why was a physically deformed, chronically ill Italian boy buried in one of the most architecturally prestigious tombs in the ancient world? Was he being used as a scapegoat? Was he some form of ritual sacrifice? Or was he a hidden royal child of mixed Roman and Ptolemaic blood, a child whose very existence was so politically dangerous or socially shameful that he had to be buried with full honors but far away from anywhere anyone would recognize him? Whatever the answer turns out to be, the conclusion the science forces us to accept is uncomfortable. The evidence that had been used to establish Cleopatra's African lineage through this specific tomb was an illusion produced by insufficient science and expectations that shaped the interpretation before the data was fully understood. So, where does that leave the investigation? It leaves us back with the historical record, and the historical record tells us that Cleopatra was a product of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek ruling family that had governed Egypt for generations. And if you want to understand what she actually looked like and what she was actually fighting against on a biological level, you do not need to find her body. You simply need to look honestly and carefully at the family tree she climbed to reach the throne. Because her family tree did not expand outward the way a normal one does. It turned inward and collapsed in on itself, producing something that geneticists find genuinely alarming. In a standard family tree, the branches spread wider as you move backward through generations. 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents. The further back you travel, the more diverse the pool of ancestors becomes. It functions like a funnel opening outward toward the wider population. Cleopatra's family tree did not work that way. The Ptolemies were a Greek dynasty ruling over Egypt, and they were absolutely determined to keep both their power and their bloodline concentrated and pure. To accomplish this, they adopted and institutionalized the ancient Macedonian custom of close-kin marriage. They did not merely marry distant cousins, they married siblings. Historians believe that Cleopatra's own parents, Ptolemy XII and Cleopatra V, were most likely full biological siblings themselves. The generations before them show a similar pattern, with evidence pointing to uncle-niece and possibly brother-sister pairings at multiple points in the family line. This was a genetic closed loop, deliberately maintained and considered a matter of dynastic policy rather than scandal. Geneticists have estimated that Cleopatra was born with a coefficient of inbreeding of over 45%. To understand what that number actually means, consider that the child of 2 first cousins carries a coefficient of approximately 6%. In royal dynasties that practiced similar patterns of close-kin marriage, such as the Habsburg dynasty of Spain, this level of genetic repetition reliably produced catastrophic outcomes. Take Charles II of Spain as the clearest possible example. Historians refer to him as Charles the Bewitched. He was the final ruler of the Spanish Habsburg line, and he was a medical catastrophe, produced by the same kind of dynastic inbreeding. The Ptolemies had been practicing for generations. Charles could not speak until he was 4 years old. He could not walk until he was 8. His jaw was so severely deformed by the characteristic Habsburg underbite that his upper and lower teeth never made contact with one another. He literally could not chew his food and swallowed everything whole throughout his entire life. When he died at 38 years old, the autopsy report described findings that read less like a medical document and more like something from a horror story. His body reportedly contained almost no blood. His skull was filled with fluid. His heart was described as being approximately the size of a peppercorn. Charles II of Spain had an estimated coefficient of inbreeding of around 25%. Cleopatra's was nearly double that figure. The science behind why this happens comes down to a mechanism called homozygosity. Under normal circumstances, your DNA is essentially a biological conversation between your mother and your father. One parent's genetic contribution compensates for and covers the weaknesses carried by the other. If your mother passes down a recessive gene linked to a particular illness or vulnerability, your father typically contributes a dominant healthy gene that overrides it. The system functions as a biological safety net, catching errors before they can express themselves harmfully. But in Cleopatra's case, there was no such conversation happening. There were no compensating contributions from a genetically distinct partner. There were simply the same genes repeating the same errors across generation after generation. Because her parents were siblings, they carried identical genetic flaws, and there was no healthy alternative gene waiting in reserve to step in and correct the damage. Biologically speaking, by every standard genetic model, she should have been a catastrophe. This level of inbreeding almost invariably produces the kinds of deformities and developmental disorders seen in the boy recovered from the octagon tomb. Physical weakness, cognitive impairment, dramatically shortened lifespans. Yet history presents us with something that appears to contradict every expectation. History tells us Cleopatra was not physically deformed. She was intellectually brilliant. She spoke 9 languages fluently. She charmed and manipulated the most powerful men in the Roman Empire. She ruled effectively for more than 2 decades. How is any of that possible given the genetic inheritance she was carrying? One compelling and troubling answer is that she may have been fighting a disease that from the outside looked remarkably like genius. To understand what she may have been battling internally, you only need to look at her great-grand-uncle, Ptolemy VII. Because of the way this family's tree collapsed in on itself, he also functions as a direct genetic mirror, a window into the biological tendencies the dynasty was passing forward through its bloodline. And what that mirror reflects is deeply unsettling. They called him Physcon, which translates roughly as potbelly. But that name was a considerable understatement of his actual condition. Historical records describe a man who was morbidly obese, whose limbs had become too weak to support the weight of his own body. He required physical assistance from supporters simply to move from place to place. But look beyond the obvious description, and the picture becomes more medically specific. Ancient sources mention a conspicuously swollen neck. They describe prominent, noticeably bulging eyes. They note chronic shortness of breath. Medical historians examining the pattern of symptoms across multiple members of the Ptolemaic dynasty have identified something significant. They see consistent markers of inherited metabolic disorders. They see a family line repeatedly struck by obesity and profound lethargy. And most chillingly of all, they see the specific clinical markers of Graves' disease, an autoimmune condition in which the immune system attacks the thyroid gland, causing it to become overactive. Graves' disease produces the bulging eyes described in ancient accounts of Ptolemy VII. It produces the goiter, the swollen, enlarged neck, and it produces something else entirely. Something that changes not just how you look, but how you behave. Graves' disease floods the body with excess thyroid hormones, pushing the entire system into a state of chronic hyperstimulation. The symptoms of this hyperstimulation include manic surges of energy, rapid and pressured speech, severe insomnia, and a pattern of erratic, high-stakes, impulsive decision-making. Read those symptoms again, and then read the historical accounts of Cleopatra. Historians have consistently praised her for what they describe as boundless vitality. They record that she could work through entire nights without rest, that she was constantly in motion, constantly planning, constantly performing. Modern observers have always framed these qualities as evidence of extraordinary genius and personal charisma. But medical anthropologists are now asking a different and considerably darker question. Was Cleopatra's legendary energy not genius at all, but a symptom? Was the fire that seemed to radiate from her actually the expression of a genetic thyroid storm, an inherited biological condition passed down to her through her great-grand-uncle and amplified by generations of inbreeding? And if that was true, How did she manage to function at the level history records? The answer may lie in a skill and a habit that conventional historians have consistently underestimated. She was not just a queen and a diplomat and a military strategist. She was also a chemist. If she was living with the chronic physical pain that inevitably accompanied the kind of pedigree collapse her family had engineered, the same grinding joint and bone agony that tormented the Habsburg monarchs centuries later, then she would have had both the knowledge and the access to treat herself. Egypt in Cleopatra's time was the pharmaceutical capital of the ancient world. Its medical traditions were sophisticated and its botanical resources were extraordinary. If she was in persistent pain, she had direct access to opium derived from the poppy fields that had been cultivated in the region for generations. This was the most potent painkiller available anywhere in the ancient world. Consider the possibility that she used it to suppress the aching in her genetically compromised joints so that she could stand tall and project strength through endless diplomatic receptions, military councils, and public ceremonies. If she was simultaneously suffering from the insomnia and the manic restlessness of Graves' disease, she may have reached for Kifi, a complex ritual incense that was burned ceremonially in Egyptian temples during the evening hours. Kifi was known specifically for its sedative properties. Plutarch himself wrote that its fragrance eased the mind towards sleep and released the accumulated tensions of the day the way a hand releases a clenched fist. For a woman possibly trembling internally with hyperthyroid energy, Kifi would not have been merely a pleasant perfume. It would have been targeted medicine. Then there is the blue lotus flower, a mildly psychoactive plant that was commonly steeped in wine and consumed across ancient Egyptian culture. It produces a sensation of gentle euphoria, a soft floating warmth. When we talk about Cleopatra's magnetic and legendary personal charisma, we describe it as though it were purely a natural gift she was born with. But was that charisma entirely natural? Or was it, at least in part, chemically maintained? Was the luminous, high-energy, almost supernatural allure she projected over the most powerful men in the world actually a carefully calibrated cocktail of blue lotus wine and her own flooded adrenal system, keeping her suspended just above the pain and exhaustion of a body that was working against her? We know with certainty that Cleopatra wrote a book on cosmetics. It was called Cosmeticon, and fragments of it survived long enough to be quoted directly by later physicians, including Galen. This tells us something important. She was not simply purchasing cosmetics the way a wealthy woman buys luxury goods. She was actively researching them. She was studying their chemistry. The question is why? If the genetic metabolic tendencies running through her family affected her skin, or if Graves' disease had given her a visible goiter, then her intense and documented obsession with cosmetics was not vanity in any conventional sense. It was concealment. It was damage control. She may have experimented with kohl specifically to reshape the visual appearance of eyes that her thyroid condition had pushed too far forward in their sockets. She may have designed the elaborate broad collars and the layered ceremonial jewelry she wore as a deliberate strategy to disguise a neck that disease had swollen beyond what she wanted the world to see. What history has read as aesthetic preference was almost certainly something closer to armor. She was arguably the world's first biohacker, a woman of extraordinary intellectual gifts, trapped inside a body that her family's choices had compromised before she was even born, using every available tool from chemistry to botany to art to project the image of a living goddess, while privately managing herself like a patient managing a chronic condition. She painted a carefully constructed lie across her face and her body. But the truth of what she actually was is still underground. And that brings everything back to where this investigation began. Beneath the limestone desert west of Alexandria, beneath the crumbling columns of Taposiris Magna, Kathleen Martinez is still digging. For 20 years, she has been pursuing the final resting place of Cleopatra, with the focused persistence of someone who has staked everything on a single conviction. And thanks to that massive tunnel, that geometric miracle of ancient engineering, she is closer than any researcher in history has ever managed to get. But after everything this investigation has uncovered and examined and reconsidered, the stakes of what she might find have changed completely. When this journey began, the world was searching for a legend, the seductress who charmed Rome into submission, the beauty immortalized by Hollywood and painted on gallery walls across the world, the goddess Isis walking the earth in human form. But science is asking us to prepare for something quite different. If Martinez breaks through that final barrier and locates the sarcophagus, she will not simply be uncovering a queen. She will be uncovering a medical archive unlike anything the modern world has ever had access to. She may find a woman who was physically small, perhaps even frail in ways her public image was engineered to conceal. A woman who hid genuine suffering behind a mask constructed from chemistry, cosmetics, and sheer force of will. A woman who looked far less like a Hollywood star and far more like a survivor who had been fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Against the greatest military empire the world had yet produced, and against her own inherited biology every single day of her reign. Finding Cleopatra will not simply rewrite the history books. It will rewrite biology textbooks. It will finally force an answer to the question that this investigation keeps circling back to. Was she the one-in-a-million genetic miracle who somehow escaped the curse her family built for themselves over generations? Or was she the silent sufferer who ruled an empire in spite of it, performing brilliance and godhood for the crowds while privately treating herself like a patient who could never afford to let anyone see the chart? For now, the excavated tunnel remains silent. It is swallowed by the heavy, suffocating stillness of the earth, and the air down there is thick with thousands of years of undisturbed dust. Above ground, the advanced DNA sequencers and the ground-penetrating radar units sit waiting like instruments that have been tuned and prepared, but have not yet heard the music they were built for. They are the modern keys designed to unlock a door that has been sealed for over 2 millennia. The ghost of the last pharaoh, Cleopatra VII, is still keeping her secrets. She is still guarding her final resting place with a stubbornness that rivals the force of personality she showed in life. She continues to elude the researchers who have dedicated years and decades to finding her. But the silence is temporary. Technology is narrowing the gap between the legend and the evidence with every passing year. And we need to be honest with ourselves about what we are actually looking for, because the truth we are chasing may not be the romantic tragedy we have always expected it to be. The reality of Cleopatra is far more layered and far more terrifying than the myth the silver screen handed us, and we accepted without question. We are not searching for a beautiful queen resting peacefully in golden splendor. We are hunting for a ruthless political survivor, a master strategist who eliminated her own siblings to consolidate power, a woman who watched everything she had built collapse in blood and chose her own exit on her own terms rather than give Rome the satisfaction of her chains. When that tomb is finally opened, we will not simply be rewriting history. We will be staring directly into the face of a raw, ancient power that has refused for 2,000 years to die quietly. So consider this. If they open the tomb and discover that Cleopatra looked nothing like the legend, that her face bore the marks of everything her bloodline put her through, does that burn the myth to the ground? Or does it make everything she accomplished so much more impressive that the myth was never large enough to contain her.